Welcome all to this being the first in a series of election webinars that Earnscliffe Strategies is hosting. My name is Allan Gregg. I am a background as a market and public opinion research principal in the Toronto office. Today I'm joined by a number of colleagues, all of whom have extensive campaign experience on their own to offer their views about what we might anticipate over the next 32 days, I guess. I'm joined by Elly Alboim from our Ottawa office, former Ottawa Bureau Chief for the CBC and a past advisor to Paul Martin, both in his capacity as Minister of Finance and also as Prime Minister of Canada. From our Toronto office, Chris Ball, who also worked for CBC and also Vice Canada. He's been an advisor to Jack Layton and NDP leader in Ontario, Andrea Horwath. Relatively new addition to the new and very welcome addition to the Earnscliffe team, also out of our Toronto office, is Rahul Bedi. Rahul was the former Deputy Chief of Staff to the Minister of Finance and the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Economic Development in Queen's Park. And last, certainly not least, is Carly Dick from the West Coast, our Vancouver office. She's worked campaigns for my old friend Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark, and has also ventured across the border into Alberta to run tours in that province. She tries to make out that she's a virtuous Western Canadian, but she actually spent 6 years at University of Toronto, so she can be accused of being a godless Torontonian. I want to remind you all that there's a Q&A function there. You should feel free to ask any questions to either an individual panelist or the panelist as the panel as a whole, because Rahul is the new guy. We've forced him to monitor those questions, and I'll go to him a couple times over the course of the next hour, and he will select a few and pose them to the group. I want to start with something that we hadn't planned as part of our original run of show. We hadn't planned it because until last night, virtually all of us have been working on fairly two widely held propositions. First is that crises benefit incumbents. Every incumbent who's run a campaign during this pandemic has been reelected. And secondly, that Atlantic Canada is a pretty much impenetrable bastion of Liberal strength. Last night, the Progressive Conservative Party scored a very stunning come-from-behind victory over the Liberals. And so I want to explore first. I mean, is there a big trend here that we've missed, or is this just an aberration? Rahul, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely, thanks, Allan. And I think a key takeaway from last night's Nova Scotia election is that campaigns absolutely do matter. Just a few months ago in June, the PCs were polling 28 points behind the Nova Scotia Liberals. And kudos to Tim Houston and his campaign team. They remained laser focused on fixing healthcare, including mental health and a notoriously bad ambulance system. They stayed on message and ran a good, clean campaign with a few errors. In contrast, I would say despite a relatively good record on managing COVID-19, Ian Rankin and the Nova Scotia Liberals still had the unenviable task of running on a track record of 8 years in government. And on top of that, I'd say ran a relatively undisciplined Liberal campaign and poor issues management as things were popping up in real time vis-a-vis candidates and the leader himself. I think the Tories seized on this. They exuded confidence and competence throughout the election, and ultimately won over the people of Nova Scotia. To your point, I think it will be interesting to see if there are any parallels that begin to appear for incumbent governments across the country. But at this point, it still seems like an anomaly, very localized to that campaign.
What about you, Elly? I mean, is there any prospect that we're entering into a Winston Churchill phase here, where we're post-crisis and people are looking for, rather than the stability of someone who managed a crisis, to change?
Well, it's an interesting question. I obviously don't know the answer. I'm from away and don't know much about what happened on the ground in Nova Scotia. And Rahul's proposition is that it's a kind of localized issue, which may very well be true. Let me just point out a couple things, one of which Rahul mentioned. The collapse of the vote, the 28-point gap disappearing in 2 short months is really startling. I don't recall a similar precedent in Canadian politics. Second of all, it's pretty clear that all of this crystallized, though it was eroding, it crystallized in the last 5 or 6 days. Polling began to catch up with it, but didn't get there. No one saw the surge, and the surge was quite extraordinary. And this is something we've seen in Canadian politics over the last 4 or 5 years. Late coming to the polls in a decision, late surges that polling misses, and surprises as people make up their mind in the last 24 hours or even in the ballot box. I think where we're at is in an era where people don't have partisan affiliations. They don't pay much attention to politics. They've got to crystallize a vote because they want to go vote. It's a civic duty. And what we're seeing is an inability of the political process to reach them until in the last 24, 48, 72 hours when they feel they have to make a choice. And I'm not sure that's going to be any different in the federal campaign.
Chris, what's your take?
Yeah, I think if I'm sitting in the Liberal campaign war room right now, I'm starting to maybe rethink what the first few days and what the next few days on this campaign will look like. I think in Nova Scotia, we saw a government who had been in power for 8 years and who had kind of had this implicit bargain with the electorate to say, well, we got you through this, so you can trust us to do everything else. Without really putting forward too much of a compelling vision. There's a lot of talk about deficit reduction at a time where I think people are a bit wary of entering into that particular fray, given the fact that we've seen historic spending that has actually helped secure people's jobs. And so if I'm the Liberal campaign, I'm going to start thinking, and this is the federal campaign, I'm going to start thinking about how am I better defining what this campaign is about, and how am I better defining, sorry, there's a massive fight with my cats happening in the background if you can hear that. Apologies. And what is the major policy pronouncements that are going to help define for the opposition and for the incumbent government the wedges throughout. So that's not really happening right now in this federal campaign. It'd be a wake-up call for the rest of both the incumbent and the opposition to see what happens next.
Chris, go manage that fight.
Taken care of.
Those of you who know Earnscliffe would know that we're a multidisciplinary advisory and strategy company, and that we work together in teams that include government relations practitioners, strategic communication specialists, and also public opinion researchers. And what we're going to make a feature of every webinar we do over the course of this election is setting the table for the conversation that follows with a review of public opinion research. I'm joined by my colleague, Hilary Martin. Hilary and our team have been doing the two things. One is that we've been aggregating all the publicly released polls that are out there in order to take out anomalies and outliers that invariably occur during these kind of horse race polls that are done throughout the country. And also every week we're doing some custom research also. So I want to call on Hilary just to show our viewers what you've been working on in the last little bit.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope you're all able to see that now. As Alan mentioned, we've been working on a few things, and one of them is tracking the publicly available polling data over time. So this graph here shows the top line national numbers from the beginning of April to today. And while national numbers are not the whole story in federal politics, it's still useful to take a look at where the parties stand today as sort of a snapshot in time at the beginning of the campaign. Towards the middle of this chart is the month of June. I know the text is quite small at the bottom, but that's June. And back there 2 months ago, we saw the Liberals with anywhere between a 5 to 9 point average lead over the Conservatives. And while they have maintained a lead, it has shrunk. Now we're seeing between 4 and 6 point lead. In fact, our own data, which we just received this morning, has the Liberals at 35 and the Conservatives at 29. So a 6 point gap there. Also wanted to just briefly note that there has been a slight uptick in NDP support. In April, it looked to be polling more in the high teens, and now it's sort of around 20s, low 20 mark. And now, as I alluded to at the beginning, we look at the top line numbers, but the regional battles are really where elections are won and lost. And there are a few things that we would like to draw your attention to regionally. And so on these charts here, we've accumulated all the data that's publicly available from December 12th, 2019 to today. So a bit of a labor intensive effort, but I think it's worth it to be able to compare where we stood back in 2019 to today. And there are a few races I want to draw your attention to, first being British Columbia. The larger dots on the y-axis of the charts indicate how each party did in the 2019 election. So you can see that back in 2019, the Conservatives won BC, 34% of the vote. And it's not the case today that they lead the province. It's in fact, while it looks a bit messy on the BC chart, it's the Liberals generally pretty consistently in the polling that we're seeing who are ahead, followed by the NDP and then the Conservatives. In fact, in our own data, again, which we just received, the Liberals are at 35, the NDP at 30, and the Conservatives at 24. So for the Liberals looking to pick up a few seats, BC is looking like a good opportunity at this time. Moving on from that, we have Quebec. In 2019, the Liberals and the Bloc were quite close, 34-32. The Liberals have managed to maintain, if not build on that lead since then, whereas the Bloc has faltered slightly. They've fallen sort of below the 30% mark. So again, perhaps something for the Liberals, somewhere for the Liberals to make a few gains. And finally, we come to Ontario. As we know, Ontario is plays a crucial part of a party's path to forming government and forming majority government. And last time the Liberals captured 42% of the vote in that province, and I believe the Conservatives around 33 and the NDP 16 or 17. And while the Liberals still lead, that lead has eroded slightly. It's sort of more in the high 30s. Our polling shows 38 currently for the Liberals in Ontario, 33 for the Conservatives, and 21 for the NDP. So two stories in Ontario. One, the Liberals still lead, but the lead is not quite as strong, which could be worrisome for them because there could be seats at stake. And the NDP growing a bit in terms of support in the province. Maybe some opportunities for them to make some gains in the Hamilton area or in urban settings. And on the, Allan, I don't know if this is a good time for me to get into the urban suburban finals.
Yeah, because I mean, what we see these polls every day in virtually every news outlet that is available, and that's all they are is horse race polls. We're doing our own custom work, and it allows us to drill down and look at trends below the surface to see what kind of dynamic might be happening in subpopulation groups or among different voting groups. And as Hillary said, we just got out of the field. I think we're in the field from the 13th to the 15th, Hillary.
Yes, correct.
And there again, there's some really interesting underlying trends that Hillary's going to review for us.
So there were a few things we noticed just this morning. And the first, we took a look at voters' preferences based on what kind of community they live in, urban, suburban, and rural. And of great interest to us was the strength of the Liberal Party in suburban Canada. I believe they're currently leading in the suburbs by 11 points, in the suburbs of British Columbia leading by 11 points, and in the suburbs of Ontario, 9. So that's some good news for the Liberals currently. And then the other interesting piece we were looking at, and just a different break of the population, are Canadians with children at home and Canadians with no children at home. And we thought this was an interesting group to look at in the context of the Conservatives and the Liberals in this election presenting two very different plans for childcare. Mm-hmm. And among those with no children at home, the Liberals have a strong lead. But among those with children at home, the Conservatives and the Liberals are virtually tied at 30 for the Liberals and 29 for the Conservatives, I believe. So while we don't know at this time which plan, if any, will be more appealing to parents, should one become the frontrunner plan, that could have an impact on the final vote count.
Really interesting. I mean, it clearly shows that the Conservatives, made a deliberate choice to have a policy that was quite different from the Liberals, knowing that they are not only competitive but virtually tied with people with children at home. And so trying to raise the salience of the childcare issue is going to be a very interesting thing to watch as things continue. So
Exactly.
that's terrific, Hillary. I really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you next week again to bring us up to date. Now,
Great.
Carding, I haven't come to you yet. You're in the unenviable position of being in what we call the commentator seat. So you're not allowed to utter any kind of grubby partisan comments like the other panelists are. You have to be objective. That said, you're a political veteran. If you had to run one of these campaigns, which one would you choose and why?
Well, my answer might be surprising. And I know we're going to talk about the Green Party dynamics a little bit later on, but my answer would be the Green Party. And the reason is because there's a lot of opportunity there. I think it could be a really fun campaign. I think there's room for growth. They've got a lot to work through, but there's room for growth. Versus, the Liberal campaign, lots of media talking about how this is their election to lose. That's a tough spot to be in. Really tough to run a campaign when that's sort of the narrative out there. So I think running the Green campaign would be a lot of fun. I mean, the leader has indicated she's going to stay in Toronto. So that restricts things a little bit. I don't think they have a ton of money, but that gives opportunity to be creative, and you don't have to deal with some of the larger logistical things that take up a lot of energy, like, planes, buses, hotels, all that kind of thing. So I think it could be a lot of fun. So that's my answer.
Very, very interesting answer, because Hillary didn't talk about it much, but you could see in those aggregated lines, both in BC and Ontario, the Greens are down quite decidedly. And it's obviously a function of the chaos they're going through. On the other side of that, we know from our other polling is that, environmental sensitivity has never been greater than it is today. So I wanted to talk about that, what that does to the political dynamic later on. But first, the so-called ballot question. I mean, anyone who's run a campaign knows that all of your messaging, all of your advertising, all of your utterances, your platforms are geared to trying to get the electorate to believe they are answering a question that plays either to your strength or to your opponent's weaknesses. I want to know from each of you, what do you think the ballot question is going to be in this election? And better yet, what the leader of the party that you know best wishes the ballot question is. Elly, you first.
I think it was pretty clear on the day the election was announced. The Prime Minister's current ballot question is, who do you trust to manage the country going forward? Whose hands are the safest? So he made a big point of calling this a historic moment, a moment of pivoting with the crisis of COVID unabated, the economic recovery to be managed. I think he is trying to position himself as safe managerial hands in a time of uncertainty. Whether that will be persuasive, obviously, is the other question.
Rahul, what does Erin O'Toole want as the ballot question in this campaign?
Yeah, I think much more than we saw in 2019. I think the election is a referendum on the Prime Minister. I think the ballot box question is whether voters want Justin Trudeau to remain Prime Minister or not. And that's how it boils down. There might be some nuance in people's minds on how that applies to the managing of the pandemic, economic recovery, competent government, and things of that nature. But I think that's how it boils down. And I think from Erin O'Toole's and a Conservatives perspective, that could be an asset or a liability. From the asset perspective, I think it works in their favor because a ballot box question like that has the making of a potential change election where Canadians signal their willingness to move on or not. And so I think that's how they're looking to frame it.
And Chris, Jagmeet Singh, what's he want the election to be about?
Yeah, I think he wants to make this about leadership, and he wants to make this about who do Canadians trust to fight for them in Ottawa when the chips are really down, and creating a frame around Canada can do better and they're ready for better and we can deliver better. Very much a campaign that's going to be focused around Jagmeet. He's an authentic, charismatic guy. We now have a bit of a record in this minority parliament of actually delivering real change and real things that actually helped people when the chips were down. So I think making this a referendum on leadership is going to help, especially when you look at the polling and you see that Jagmeet has a net positive leadership rating of +16. The Prime Minister or the Liberal leader and Aaron O'Toole can't say the same, right? And so very much focus on Jagmeet, his vision, his fighting for you, and the record and what we can do next, I think is really what he wants to make this and what we should be making this ballot question about.
I've got a supplementary to that, because you can run a positive campaign, but you can also run a negative campaign. And often negative campaigns are more effective because they play right into that cynicism and sense of fear that a lot of voters have. I mean, your ballot questions, all three of you, were very positive and upbeat. Any of these political parties going to get down into the gutter and start making it about the other guy, do you think?
It's already happening.
Talk to me about that.
I mean, if you look at the below the tip of the iceberg Facebook ad buys, a lot of the campaigns, even the NDP is running contrast ads around for example, the wealth tax, right? And that Justin Trudeau voted against an NDP motion asking to increase taxes on the wealthiest in this country in order to pay for things like childcare and whatnot. So we're already starting to see that. So obviously your big broad message should be let's come together towards a common vision message. But below the surface, in social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and all these other things, you're seeing that start to come out as well. So you're seeing, for example, the Liberals are running ads just before the writ dropped in Ontario around gun control, and contrast ads against Aaron O'Toole, saying that Aaron O'Toole is going to repeal gun control laws. So all of that's still happening. It's just you're not seeing it yet come to the surface, because it's all about that tactical, all about that social media targeting right now.
Anyone else want to add to this?
Well, I guess, you asked us what the leaders wanted or parties wanted as the ballot question. The other issue is, what is the ballot question? And can they succeed in holding the frame that they want? And that's not clear. Absent a galvanizing issue other than COVID, holding your frame may not be as easy as it looks, which leads you to what is inevitable in every campaign. Context changes. As context changes, parties move more negative. It's just the way things work. So as the gap narrows, as things become more competitive, parties will be less focused on holding their positive frame and more focused on trying to denigrate or reduce the opposition. That's an inevitability. And as you say, it often works.
Carleen, I mean, this campaign is obviously without precedent for the obvious reason that this is the only federal campaign we've ever run during a pandemic. I mean, you run campaigns, you run leader tours, you organize big rallies. How is the pandemic going to change the way this election is actually conducted?
Well, I think from a voter's perspective and what they see on television, it isn't going to be that different. The leaders are still going to try and do the same types of events that they normally do, but there will be slight differences. So they can't do the big massive rallies that they did in 2019. One thing I think about is all the visuals we saw coming from the Liberal campaign in 2019, with Trudeau surrounded by hundreds of people, him surrounded, turning around, shaking hands, that kind of thing. That won't be possible this time around. I think, in some provinces, you'll be able to do bigger gatherings, so-called rallies, but they're gonna look a little different. I also think door knocking might be impacted. I haven't been out yet, but I will. And I wonder if people are going to be as open to opening their doors and speaking to people now in the current situation versus in the past. So I think, like I said, the campaigns are going to do the as much as they can to have the same sort of visuals as previous campaigns, but it's going to be a little bit different.
The U.S. Presidential election, mail-in ballots, very controversial and showed a massive demarcation in use based on partisan choice. Any prospect that that could happen here in this election, do you think?
I'm not sure yet. I mean, lots of people are talking about how there could be tons of mail-in ballots, and it could, I shouldn't say lots of people, some people talking about how there could be a lot of mail-in ballots, and the election may be too close to call, that kind of thing. We, Alan, I think you mentioned this at the beginning. We had an election in British Columbia in October of last year, so in the middle of the campaign, or in the middle of the pandemic. And there were lots of mail-in ballots, but we still knew the result of the election, right? It wasn't an overwhelming amount of people that did mail-in ballots. I saw something interesting in the news the other day that conservative voters like to vote in person, and liberal voters prefer to vote online, or vote by mail. And that this potentially is a concern to the liberal team, because the process to get a mail-in ballot and fill it out and mail it back in is somewhat cumbersome. So maybe that'll have a little bit of an impact. But I think it still remains to be seen. I think people will still get out and get to the polls and cast their ballot.
And line up at the school to cast a ballot.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, there'll probably be in British Columbia. They had more advanced poll days, longer hours, those kinds of things, so that people felt more comfortable coming out and voting in person. I think that did have an impact. So I suspect Election Canada will do something similar. So you might see a lot more advanced votes than voting on election day than in previous elections,
right.
But we'll see.
Elly, before the writs were issued, I mean, there was a lot of speculation whether the Liberals were going to run their campaign as either a referendum on their management of the pandemic, which was quite good, in fact, in terms of the assessment, or in fact, they'd be looking to seek some mandate for a future program. As we look like we're maybe in the midst of the fourth wave of the pandemic, are they going to have to do both now?
Well, indisputably. And I think the Prime Minister signaled that on the day that he called the election, that he's both looking backwards at COVID management and looking forward at laying out an economic recovery strategy. But I think that you can't overestimate the potential impact of COVID. We're continuing to see exponential growth. I know that our own polling, as described earlier, Alan, in an earlier conversation, has shown that a lot of people think we are post-pandemic, but
right.
That's not the way the provincial governments are reacting. It's not the way the premiers are reacting, and it's not what the modeling is showing. And we've got 4 weeks to go. At the rates of exponential growth we are seeing now. We are going to see surges, particularly around the return to school. And the anxiety levels are going to start increasing. And in my view, COVID is going to rise to the fore as people try to figure out how to manage it and how to deal with it personally. I think context today is we're just emerging out of July. Things were pretty good. We're beginning to see the signs. But if we get this rate of increase, I think that every voter is suddenly going to understand that wave 4 is real and it's quite significant. And then we'll have to make a series of decisions based on that.
You talked about how sometimes you can't control your messaging, and then it denigrates into something more negative. How likely, if that is the case, as you speculate, that the Liberals will try to make vaccination and vaccination mandates the ballot question?
I think that's clear that we've begun to migrate that way already. It appears to be the wedge point between the Conservatives and Liberals around mandatory vaccines, and maybe vaccine passports as well. A number of Conservative premiers and Conservative-leaning premiers, like Premier Legault, are starting to ratchet up mandatory vaccinations. Premier Ford's caucus was told yesterday, if you're not vaccinated, you don't sit in caucus. So the private sector, maybe most importantly, is increasingly demanding double vaccination for access to a variety of its locations and services. So we are going to head into, I think, a larger ethical and moral debate about mandatory vaccines, about vaccine passports, and there is a cleavage between the parties. And whether Mr. O'Toole will move more towards that position or hang tough, may be the story of this election by the time we hit September 20th.
Well, let me ask a variation on that very theme to Rahul, because I mean, the Conservatives seem to have a bit of a catch-22. I mean, they've got the highest floor to the extent that their core is most with them, but they have the lowest ceiling. Their ability to grow was always stymied by the fact that, you know, that the Liberals and the NDP are not that attracted to them. Yet they're behind. So they're going to have to reach out and get new voters if they're going to get over the finish line. Yet the very policies that might attract the current Liberal and NDP voter might antagonize or demotivate their base. Vaccines being a perfect example of that. How do you manage that conflict, Rahul?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll say sometimes starting out of the gates with low expectations can be a blessing in disguise. I think Tim Houston and Nova Scotia PCs are a glowing example of that. But to the root of your question, I think there's sort of two components. One is continuing to reverse that no by default perception that's developed among some swing voters and that's limited the Conservatives' accessible base in recent elections. And then I think it's also better framing the terms of combat, I'll say, regarding the key issues in this election and doing a better job of framing them on the Conservative terms. To the first point, you know, I think the Conservatives in recent years have moved this direction, but they can't bury their head in the sand and outright concede certain issues. I'd say in the past, issues such as the environment and Indigenous reconciliation were perhaps seen as niche issues of the left, but there is a consensus that these are mainstream issues that matter to undecided and importantly, prospective switching voters. If a party's looking to build a broad enough coalition to govern, they cannot be perceived as ignoring these issues altogether. And the rub, obviously, in terms of doing that while also maintaining your base, is not simply adopting the policies of other parties or accepting how they're framing them. Rather, it's putting forward clear, competent, conservative solutions to tackling those issues that helps limit the anger among the base, but importantly provides prospective swing voters the ability to judge the merits of different solutions, which is well within their rights, but it does not allow them to simply ignore Conservatives by default as their second choice, perhaps, based on the outdated perception that Conservatives don't have solutions on these issues or don't care about those issues. And I think the platform released by Erin O'Toole earlier this week makes an attempt at squaring the circle in a number of those areas.
Well, let me ask you about that, because we've seen platforms out early in this campaign. Often it's closer to election day, and the platform that the Conservatives released a couple of days ago surprised a lot of people. It surprised a lot of people because it had a lot of things in there that they had never heard from Conservatives, encouraging the union membership, some pretty rigorous kind of anti-big business rhetoric, the derision of downtown elites. What are they trying to do with this platform?
Well, I think it gets back to the point in terms of the Conservatives resting back, framing the terms of combat. This is something the federal Liberals have been very good at over their time in government. And at the outset of this campaign, I think the issue of mandatory vaccines is a very good example of what's dominated the news cycle, and that's on the terms of the federal leader and of the Liberals. But I think it's important to look at, I think, a recent poll that was done this week, and it found that affordability and the cost of living was the number one issue for all voters, but interestingly was the number one issue of both NDP and Conservative voters, and the second highest amongst Liberal voters. And the populist style proposals that were in the CPC platform, I think, are very much connected to driving that as the main thread and connecting that in the minds of voters. Items like the retail GST holiday, lowering cell phone and internet bills, lowering food prices, offering a 50% discount on restaurant trips, building 1 million new homes, all aimed directly at that suburban voter and those pocketbook issues that Conservatives are betting they can win on, but also importantly expand out their accessible voter base and be attractive to those prospective switchers. So I think they're looking to thread that needle. And I think the childcare proposal that they've put forward also falls within this framing. The conservative approach is putting dollars directly into parents' pockets. It's respecting parents' choice. And it's also more workable for shift-based workers who may be working on that auto assembly plant or in that Amazon warehouse, who may not work a cookie cutter 9 to 5. And it's enacted immediately and not 5 years down the road.
Let me bring in Chris here, because the campaigns 2015, 2019 to slightly lesser extent. I mean, the result was a function of the Liberals being quite successful at coalescing the center-left vote. And they did that by really raising the boogeyman of a rabid right-of-center conservative government. That's what you were really doing. You were kind of voting for me to keep those guys out in no small measure. It's going to be way tougher 2021 for them to do. I think the last Abacus poll I saw that only 9% of NDP voters believe the Conservatives are going to win. So they're not afraid of how does that change the dynamic, and what does the NDP have to do to attract past Liberal voters who are motivated principally by keeping the Conservatives out of power?
Yeah, I think we're doing some of that work already, right? So the frame generally around strategic voting, just kind of back it up a second, has always been, well, it could be worse, right? So vote for us and it'll be not that, right? And so, which sets the bar incredibly low and benefits, the Liberals, who then take a sort of a lot of leeway to promise but not get things done because, hey, things could be worse, right? So I think Canadians have now seen what worse could look like throughout the pandemic. We saw what lowered expectations did and did not deliver. And so the NDP is going into this campaign talking a lot about better, right? They're talking about better as possible. They're talking about their platform is even called Ready for Better, because they've offered now Canadians a real alternative for, yeah, you can have the sort of, it's not them, but you're not getting what you actually want. And we are here to actually deliver on the things that matter to you when the chips are down. So we saw that with paid sick days. We saw that an increase in length and amount of CERB at a very crucial time. And so I think doubling down on that record to say, you know what, you seem to be open to rejecting the Conservative frame, check mark. You're open to progressive policies, check mark. So now let's actually get them done. And the guy to get them done is Jagmeet Singh. So that's kind of the overall frame. And I think they're working on kind of turning that strategic vote, and we can have a whole webinar about how strategic voting isn't actually strategic. But the real value in that the real strategic vote for you and your family, if you actually want to deliver on the things that matter to you, is the NDP. And that actually does resonate in a lot of these ridings where, for example, like Hillary brought up Hamilton, right? Those are three-way races where New Democrats are fighting both Liberals and Conservatives. And it's quite an easy frame to say, listen, like, you don't have to vote for team blue and cuts and all that other stuff. You don't have to vote for team red and inaction, but you can vote for team orange and actually get things done. So I think you're seeing some of that in how they position the platform and their overall message around getting stuff done.
You mentioned earlier on that Jagmeet Singh's approval rating being the highest of all the leaders. And I've been watching the stuff he's posting on TikTok, which is really quite remarkable in terms.
Allan Gregg has a TikTok account. That's so exciting.
But in terms of political communication, something I've never seen before. And he obviously is really connecting with young people. That's a constituency that basically sent Justin Trudeau to the Prime Minister's office in 2015. How does he capitalize on that appeal and get especially young voters actually to go to the polls?
Totally. So the numbers are great. Still a bunch of work to do. So again, because a lot of young people have also been programmed over the last two elections around that anti-conservative strategic voting frame. And there's also a number of barriers to youth voting that kind of create that gap between the polling and the ballot box. So I think the key for the NDP is on gaining and retaining that support is making the contest with the leaders. Again, Jagmeet plus 16 on that leadership metric. He's also, to your point about TikTok, he's playing in spaces that other leaders aren't, and so he's more present where other leaders aren't, right? And so just even the virtue of the platform itself. So you can kind of, I made this bad analogy on another panel, but the Justin Trudeau government is sort of the Instagram government, right? Where it's all very carefully manicured and like the photo on the boat and looks great. But if you pull out, it's actually, he's like in Toronto Harbor, there's a bunch of seagulls and it's just not really what's the photo. Whereas TikTok's a much more authentic medium. And I think he's really doubling down on that authenticity and that emotional connection and that trust. So they have to double down there for sure. I think also affordability, right? So affordability is a major issue for young people. It's a major issue for NDP, Liberal, and Green Party voters. They've seen their jobs go away during this pandemic. They more and more precarious employment, the dream of home ownership, forget about it, right? And so talking about these issues that directly connect to making their future better, they didn't see pre-pandemic Canada working for them, so they sure as heck don't see post-pandemic Canada working for them. So very much zoning in on those, what we would kind of call pocketbook issues, but housing, wealth tax, that's also a wedge issue for a lot of young voters as well, because they're seeing a system that's very much tilted in one favor and not in theirs. And then finally, I think they're just being a lot smarter about how they actually campaign, right? So we talk a lot about the mechanics of the campaign, and it's like you go to the Governor General, and then there's announcements, and there's a platform, and then there's a debate, and then the campaign ends, right? And I think we miss some of that the other ways of organizing a campaign that the NDP are really tapping into. So things like distributed organizing, right? So it's not just, hey, let's go canvass at your door. They're doing things like friend banks, where Gen Z and millennials are a lot more tightly tied to their friend group, and they really very much listen to influencers within that friend group. So they're tapping into those influencers within friend groups to call your 5 friends and say, here's why Jagmeet's gonna help us. Here's why Jagmeet's the right vote for us. And so if we want a different result, we obviously have to do things differently. And I think this time around, now with a fully funded campaign, 2019 was 10.9 million, now he's got 25 in the bank. We can now start to really help close that gap between the polling and the ballot box through better message, a better leader, and better tools.
I want to bring the viewers in. Rahul, you've been monitoring questions that have come from people who are listening in. Anything there that you're particularly interested in that you want to pose to the panel?
Sure. The question here, it's about the platforms, but less so in terms of their substance, but more from a campaign tactics perspective. So we have a question here specific to the NDP platform, but what was the NDP's rationale in releasing the platform prior to the start of the election, as opposed to what we've seen, previously, which is throughout the election or towards the end?
Chris, I mean, we noticed that too. I mean, the platform in 2021 looks almost like the platform in 2019. I mean, what are they doing?
Yeah, I think there's a message inherent in the fact that a lot of the broad thematics and even some of the bigger pieces like pharmacare, childcare, wealth tax are still there because they haven't been fixed yet, right? These are still issues that are top of mind for the core voters, for us, that they're not seeing this current government take any sort of realistic or big broad strokes action on. I think so. Releasing it it's going to look kind of like 2019, but with some differences. Like I think our wealth tax promise is actually going to rake in more money than what we promised in 2019, is a message in itself. You know what you're going to get from us, you know what we're going to fight for, and you know what you're not getting from the other guys. Releasing it early also, it gives voters in a pandemic election where some of the mechanics of voting are going to be a bit different, right? Where people are going to be going to early voting, where people might be casting a mail-in ballot early. It gives voters the chance to really dig into what the NDP has to say early and often. It also gives the party a strategic advantage to be able to talk about these platform pieces over and over and over again, right? Traditionally, when a platform launch happens, it's towards maybe the last few weeks of the campaign to kind of gobble up all the media attention. This way, you get to kind of pull out the things that you know are resonating, announce, re-announce in key ridings. But it also provides a lot of tactical flexibility, especially in a leader-focused campaign, right? It allows you to say, here's what we're about, and then put Jagmeet up there over and over and over in his authentic way to reinforce the message, but also do highly targeted announcements in key battleground ridings, right? While we're running a national campaign, we're also very focused on some key target seats that were marginal at best for us in a polling in 2019. And so when we can get into there and then do those very highly tactical things to swing some of those ridings in our favor, I think that's that's the rationale for doing it early. It helps us on a lot of different ways and gives our campaign a lot more flexibility.
But we talked about both the Conservative and the NDP campaigns. I want to bring Elly in on the Liberal platform, and then Carling, who we haven't heard enough of yet. But that it strikes me that a lot of the promises and programs that the Liberals are going to draw attention to in this campaign are things that they've already announced that are based in the previous budgets. Do they have enough news generating firepower to get any momentum in this campaign if they rely on announcements that have already been made?
Let me challenge the premise a bit. Maybe I think that's fair.
Tell surprise.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is they spent $100 billion in April in a budget. They announced the largest childcare program in the history of the country. And there's $30 billion worth of income and business support for COVID. So it's not as if there's been no activity. The question, Allan, though, is, are we discussing the right things? And I'm not sure anymore. You know, as Chris makes a difference between TikTok and Instagram, it makes you think, is there a meta campaign that we can't monitor at this level? Are we using the right yardsticks to measure it? Does the issue set matter as much as it used to? Do platforms matter as much as they used to? In a world of no significant partisan ties, tremendous uncertainty, lurch in public opinion, volatility driven by exterior context, are election campaigns moving along a different axis than commentators and media are prepared to watch and understand? And I'm not sure we are anymore. And I think Nova Scotia is in part
an illustration of that. Very interesting.
Yeah. So let me just hang on. Let me just go one more point. I'm sorry. You know, Chris is very persuasive, but ultimately the issue is, I think, who's going to govern the country and who do you trust to govern the country? I'm not trying to do the Liberal ballot question. That's not the issue. I think ultimately people try to decide who they want to be their prime minister and who they want to be their government. And until the NDP can get by that significant obstacle about not being seen as a potential governing party, a lot of this discussion is beside the point. And I understand the youth vote, and I understand the way the polling is breaking, but we also have to remember that in the 50 plus cohort, which is the largest voting cohort currently, it doesn't break towards the NDP. In fact, it breaks decidedly against the NDP. I'm not trying to challenge what the NDP is doing. I'm just saying we're in a different environment, and we have to be careful that the yardsticks and measurement tools we're using are not traditional ones that are somewhat outdated.
I don't want to get into a dog fight here, a cat fight, but Chris probably have
We've already had that.
A two-word response for you, Rachel Notley. Anyway, let me just go to Carling, because you haven't been drawn in here enough. I got a two-part question for you. I mean, one, you're a political junkie. What are you watching for in this campaign? If you had to keep people some advice about one thing they should keep their eye on, because if you see that one thing starting to happen, big stuff is going to happen. What would that be? And secondly, do you see anything in the platforms that we've talked about of any of the parties that also has that potential?
Well, let me start with the second part of the question, and it's been raised a few times here, but I'm going to say it again. I do think childcare is a big issue, and frankly, I don't think any of the parties are getting it right. There's some good things about each. You know, the Conservatives offering money, the claim that, you know, people need the support now, but that doesn't create childcare spaces. And creating childcare spaces is very difficult. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but money up front isn't going to create those spaces. But then, you know, some of the other platforms, I'm not so sure that things are going to get get done as soon as they need to be done. Childcare has been a big issue for families this past year. Trying to balance working at home and looking after the kids has really raised that, I think, to the forefront of their mind. So I think even if it doesn't become, it has been a talking point, but even if it doesn't become a major talking point, I think people are paying attention to what parties are offering in that space.
Let me give you another poke on that, because
Sure.
some of us who are old enough have seen this movie before. 2006 had essentially exactly the same thing, with liberals saying, or promising a national program, and the conservatives under Harper saying, no, put money in the pockets of individuals. Any sense which of those two approaches is going to be the most appealing to the kind of swing voter that both parties need to attract to win?
Tough to say. I would say probably, well, I really tough question, Allan. Probably the Liberals, I would say, just because, I'm the idea of getting money is from, what the Conservatives are offering. I think is of interest to parents, but there's still that issue of, okay, so they have the money, where do I actually send my kid? We still have the problem of families or parents having to find childcare for their kids before they're even born, right? I have friends that have, they find out they're pregnant and they have to go and sign up for daycare. Their kid's not even born yet. So, I don't think that anybody's offering the perfect solution, but if I had to say, I'd say probably the Liberals are on the better track in that respect. But I do want to answer the first part of your question that you asked. So switching gears a little bit, something that people should watch, particularly closer to the end of the campaign, is where the leaders go. Because that matters. So if the leaders are going to areas where they currently hold cold seats, and won those seats by quite a bit in 2019, if the leaders are going to those places towards the end of the campaign, that signals that they're potentially in trouble, because they're trying to shore up the support and win those seats or hold those seats that they already have. If you see them venturing into ridings that they don't currently hold, that might indicate that they think there's an opportunity to win that, or that they're sort of nationally in a better spot. So really encourage people to look where the leaders are going, because particularly in my experience working on leaders tours, it's definitely a strategy.
Very tactical, very tactical. Got one question for Rahul, who's been quiet here for a minute, and then we're running out of time. I'm going to ask everyone just for their final thoughts. But Rahul, you saw Hillary right off the top saying that the Conservatives are running 11 points behind in the suburbs. The fact of the matter is that Canadian elections, and for the recent past, have been won in the 905 in the suburbs of Vancouver, the lower mainland. And those areas are also populated disproportionately by recent arrivals to Canada. What do the Conservatives have to do to win those ridings and to attract new Canadians?
Absolutely, Allan. I think the Conservatives, yearn to recapture the magic that they saw in 2011, where there was a major breakthrough in those areas. And to your point, both the GTA and the Metro Vancouver areas are well on their way to being nearly 60% foreign-born by 2030. So it's a major and ongoing issue. There was an hypothesis at the time, following 2011, that these new Canadians are inherently small C conservative, and that they would represent a fundamental shift in the electoral map in the Conservatives' favor. And to your earlier point, I think the Conservatives are making a similar bet on private sector union members this time around under the same hypothesis that clearly has not taken root. And the federal Liberals have had a lock on these areas ever since. I think the Conservatives have reason to be optimistic. For the first time ever, the modern Conservative Party is being led by a leader from the GTA. Aaron O'Toole's seat is in Durham, and his father represented that riding as well, and they have a lot of roots there. But it won't happen overnight. They'll have to rebuild trust with these communities, recruit the right candidates, and bolster Aaron O'Toole's personal brand and recognition, which matters. And I think constantly hammer home that the Conservatives are the best on pocketbook issues and affordability, the economy, public safety, and managing the books, which again are all priorities that are outlined in the Conservative platform. I'd say two sort of more silent issues that matter on a more regional basis or local basis are immigration policy, which obviously play an outsized role in these communities, particularly on family reunification. The federal Liberals introduced a lottery-based system that's been met with mixed results. In their platform, the Conservatives have committed to scrapping this lottery and expanding the super visa program. It won't make national news, but it makes a big difference in these key ridings and may give their candidates some positive points of contrast. But again, I think Justin Trudeau and his cabinet ministers remain popular. They still, particularly the Prime Minister, has that celebrity appeal. And Jagmeet Singh, of course, is the first Sikh federal leader, has a seat in BC, but also has a strong, sophisticated political machine in Brampton.
In Brampton, for sure.
Previously represented.
Well, and Doug Ford did very well in the 905 in the last campaign.
That's exactly right. And I think it ties back to that populism piece. Doug Ford, which holds a number of these, and the Ontario PCs hold a number of these seats that Aaron O'Toole wants to break through in suburban Ontario. And he's hoping that brand of populism that Premier Ford won with is a winning recipe for the federal Conservatives.
Say we're running out of time. So final thoughts there, Chris. You want to kick Elly in the knees on the NDP's management competence?
No, I mean, I think sometimes, and I adore my colleague Elly, but sometimes rhetoric like that, I think, is part of the reason why we see young people not engaged in the political process. When people are told constantly that it's 65 plus matter, and yes, the polling, I get it. The polling is the polling. I think that is part of the cynicism that has been baked into that cohort for election after election of being transactional elections that don't speak to their issues and don't have a leader that they feel represents them. I think that's part of the problem that Jagmeet is trying to overcome. Right. And so we can debate the management competence as much as you want, but I think Jagmeet and the team has shown the management competence during this last parliament by getting CERB extended, by getting paid sick leave. All those things are part of that package that we're delivering to Canadians to say, we are competent managers. We are people who get things done. Elly, final thoughts?
Well, two final thoughts. I'll try and do them quickly. One is it wasn't rhetoric, it was just fact-based about how cohorts vote. I'm not challenging their competence. I'm just saying that the public view is the NDP is not a governing party yet. That's all. It was pretty simple. But my last thought is, this is a strange campaign. At the moment, there's no galvanizing issue. There's no central thread. There's not very much interest. We're in the midst of summer. This thing will crystallize one way or the other in the last 10 days of the campaign post-debate. And it can crystallize in a variety of ways. My view is if COVID becomes the overarching issue, then management of COVID and competence is going to be the clear issue. If it's not, then a campaign about nothing can be derailed and distracted and lots of things can happen. And I think we are perhaps looking at a very uncertain result unless the external context forces a hard choice on who you want to govern the country.
We refer to that as the Seinfeld campaign, the campaign about nothing. Last word for you, Carlin. Oh.
For me, I would say, I think this is going to be a pretty boring election for the next couple of weeks. I could be wrong. We've said throughout campaigns matter, but I think it's going to be a little bit boring for the next couple of weeks, and hopefully post Labor Day things will get a little bit more interesting, and the ballot box question will become a little more clear, because I don't think it is right now.
I want to thank you all for joining me. Really good conversation. Those who tuned in via Zoom platform, I wanted to let you know if we didn't get to one of your questions, and I'm sorry we didn't. In fact, we didn't get to a lot of the questions that we had scripted earlier. What we will do is we'll answer them directly. We'll also send you all a link of this conversation. This is the time and place, Wednesday at noon Eastern Standard Time, 9 o'clock Pacific Time, that we'll hold the next 5. We're going to rotate. These are 4 sterling individuals here, only but 4 people at Earnscliffe who have election experience. We've got about another 20 of them to talk to over the course of the next 5 weeks. So we're really looking forward to that. And we want to thank you all. Take care of yourselves.